The air in the south of England in late winter of 1944 carried the smell of sea salt and damp earth. Cold, like a thin layer of ice pressed flat against the ground. Years of air raids had left deep and shallow scars scattered across the surrounding landscape, yet the prisoner of war camp still maintained its order. The medical system on British soil continued to function under the prolonged pressure of wartime, with various hospitals and POW medical wards managed under a unified framework, and every prisoner of war recorded, classified, and treated. Documents from the British Ministry of Defence explicitly required that the standard of care must not be lowered because of a prisoner's status, a regulation that was part of the wider system and one of the few bottom lines in war that was strictly enforced. The medical huts of the camp were long, wooden structures that looked simple and rudimentary from the outside, yet were kept clean. At night, the light inside was always brighter than in the other barracks, because this was the place that had to be ready at any moment to receive wounded and sick prisoners brought in from the coast. When Keller was lifted down from the ambulance, he only felt a hollow sensation like falling into empty space. The journey had been long, his wound had stiffened, and he could no longer distinguish whether what he felt was pain or numbness. Damp air seeped through the worn army blanket into his skin, and he could not even raise his head to confirm whether he had truly arrived anywhere at all. As the stretcher swayed, he heard the footsteps of British soldiers, but he could not understand their low exchanges. The voices sounded as if they were coming through water, merging with his gradually blurring consciousness. When he was carried into the medical hut, the light brought him briefly back to awareness. He smelled iodine, hot water, and metal instruments, scents that were unfamiliar, yet carried a sense of order that frontline field hospitals had never possessed. Someone was examining his wound, moving with great care. When he felt that hand press near the injured area, his skin seemed to awaken for an instant. It was not hostility, nor was it a rough inspection, but a calm and deliberate touch. He could not see clearly who it was, but from the continuity and precision of the movements, he could tell that this was a trained doctor assessing whether he would live or die. The sounds around him became more regular, hot water being lifted, instruments colliding softly, curtains being drawn, as if some kind of preparation was accelerating. He could not lift his head, but he knew what it meant. Surgery. He had not expected to undergo an operation in the hands of the enemy, and even less had he expected to survive long enough to reach this point. His breathing began to lose rhythm, and his consciousness fell into darkness again and again, each time taking more effort to rise back up. He did not know whether he would wake again, nor could he judge whether this attempt at treatment could truly pull him out from the depths. The last thing he remembered was someone checking his pulse, the movements firm and unhurried. In that moment, he suddenly realized that, whether he wished it or not, his life was being placed in the hands of a doctor from a foreign country. He no longer had the strength to feel grateful, nor the energy to resist, and could only let his body cling as much as possible to that thin, almost invisible line of breath. Between drowsiness and pain, he had for the first time a vague thought. If he could wake up again, perhaps he would understand what this operation had truly meant. But before that, there was only one thing he could do: not die on this particular night. When Keller briefly regained consciousness again, he could no longer tell how much time had passed. Faint vibrations came from the wooden walls as if someone were moving quickly nearby. The air was filled with a sharper metallic smell mixed with the scent of fabric that had been heated. His breathing began to grow rapid, and it felt as if a damp stone had been placed on his chest. Every attempt to draw in air was like dragging it harshly across the surface of his wound. He knew his body was deteriorating rapidly, but could not tell whether it was due to infection or blood loss. He could only catch fragments of sensation in the gaps of his fading awareness. Someone was moving instruments, the clear yet controlled clinks carrying almost no emotion, revealing only a sense of urgency. Light formed a blurred whiteness behind his eyelids, making him aware that his position was being adjusted, the bed tilting slightly, indicating that he was being pushed towards somewhere closer to the surgical area. The damp air stalled in his throat, making it impossible to swallow, and he could only passively feel his body being slowly straightened, lifted, and secured. He could not understand any of the spoken words, but from the pattern of the movements he could sense a unified, orderly rhythm, proof that this was a well-trained team at work. He felt someone pressing down on his forearm, with the blood vessels under his skin being gently touched, as if to confirm his condition. The movement was swift, yet carried a focused, professional attention. He could not lift his eyes to see who it was, but from the steadiness of the fingers he could tell that it was not a soldier, but medical staff. That hand was slightly warmer than the air outside, allowing him, for a brief moment, to realize that he had not been abandoned. Then another smell drifted in, an acrid yet faint medicinal scent, carried on the warmth of the room, indicating that preparation for anesthesia had begun. His heartbeat suddenly quickened from tension, but his body was too weak. The change in rhythm only stirred a short tremor in his chest, before it was quickly swallowed again by exhaustion. He tried to distinguish the direction of the footsteps, but felt his head grow heavier and heavier. Light seeped through the narrow gap of his eyelids, and he could see only blurred shapes moving like shadows held in place under the lamp. Someone adjusted the height of the instruments. Metal trays collided softly, and a wave of air, quickly cooled by disinfectant, spread through the room. He understood that these sounds and smells should have belonged to healing, but in his perception they felt more like the last remaining parts of the world were being gradually gathered toward some final point. His body was growing colder, his fingers completely unable to curl, and his breathing pattern began to scatter beyond his control, as if it might at any moment be swallowed entirely by the darkness. In another brief moment of clarity, he sensed a gentle yet steady brightness at the side of the bed, the kind of warmth that only appeared when a surgical lamp was shining directly on the body. It was not comforting, but a mechanical brightness that told him he was being pushed toward a line that would determine life or death. He heard water being poured into a vessel, heard cloth being unfolded, and heard some instrument being checked repeatedly. He did not understand what any of it meant. He only knew that these things formed a process that could not be avoided, and that he could only drift passively within it. His chest was suddenly pressed very lightly, as though someone were confirming whether he still had any response. He could barely react, able only to maintain his breathing in the faintest possible way. In that moment, he realized that he had reached a point beyond anything he could handle alone, and that everything that would happen next was no longer his to decide. The light grew stronger, almost pressing down on his eyelids, making him want to shy away. But he could not. That familiar metallic smell returned to the air, stronger than before, a sign that the surgical instruments were already in place. His consciousness began to fragment, each wave of drowsiness deeper than the last, and each time he struggled back up it felt more like a reflexive resistance to vanishing altogether. In the final faint flicker of awareness, he felt someone gently securing his arm, the movement steady and without hesitation. In the instant that hand rested on his skin, Keller suddenly understood that he was being treated by the enemy, and that his life at that moment was entirely entrusted to these unfamiliar actions. He had no way to express fear or trust, and could only let fatigue and anesthesia draw him into a deeper darkness. Before losing consciousness, the only clear sensation he had was of that beam of light resting on his face, as if telling him that whatever the outcome, the operation had begun, and this would be his only chance to continue living. When Keller's consciousness was drawn completely into darkness, he thought he might remain there forever. Yet the darkness was not static. It resembled layers of water at different depths, sometimes pressing on him so heavily that he could not breathe, sometimes, in unexpected instants, pushing him back toward a half-awake state, allowing him to barely sense that he still existed in some corner of the world. The first time he surfaced into this half-consciousness, he heard a sound like wind seeping through gaps in the wooden boards, but then realized it was not wind at all. It was the faint rustle of cloth being quickly adjusted under the lamp. He felt a pressure near his chest, as if someone were positioning his body. The sensation was not painful, but carried a firm precision that seemed to penetrate the skin, letting him know that someone was preparing for a crucial step. What followed was a slight yet unmistakable metallic scraping, clear, rhythmic, without emotion, like the distant striking of a pendulum, the sound of the scalpel being placed back on the tray. He could not open his eyes, nor could he fully comprehend these details, but memories of field dressing stations at the front made him dimly aware that these sounds meant the operation had entered an irreversible phase. He had no strength to struggle, no energy left to think, and could only wait, in the deepest part of his awareness, for the next time he would be pushed upward. The second time he rose toward consciousness like reaching the surface of the water, it came quickly and with a sharp sting. Deep within his chest and abdomen, it felt as if a current of electricity had struck for a brief instant before sliding back into a dull ache. It was not complete pain, but more like his body struggling at the edge of anesthetic suppression. He could make no sound, Yet he could feel his heartbeat being forced back into a steadier rhythm, as though someone outside was holding that collapsing lifeline in place. He dimly understood that the operation was actively racing against time, while he himself could only remain in the depths, the passive subject of a rescue. After that, he lost all sense of time. When his awareness surfaced for the third time, the world had become a field of light and blurred shadows, resembling the images that appear before the eyes in moments of extreme exhaustion. He never fully opened his eyes, but could feel the light spreading across his skin. It was not warmth, but a constant, oppressive brightness that made him realize his body was still exposed on the operating table. There was a heavy pulling sensation in his chest, like someone carefully extracting intact threads from rotting fabric. The movement was slow, cautious, and without hesitation, suggesting that the operation was moving through the infected area and that any mistake could push him abruptly into death. He wanted to move, but could not. The anesthesia lay over his body like a thick curtain, gathering all possible motion into stillness. Only his heartbeat occasionally stirred in the depths, briefly reminding him that he had not yet disappeared. In one short instant of clarity, he sensed a shadow shifting above the light, the outline of the surgeon's posture cast under the lamp. The shadow was steady, unhurried. In that moment, for the first time, he felt a strange sense of safety, not born of trust, but of a basic instinctive judgment. The operation was still continuing, and he had not been given up. Time began to lose meaning. He could no longer tell how many times he had awakened, nor whether he was still in the same place. The alternation of darkness and light washed over him like tides, pushing him near and far by turns. Until at some undetermined point, he felt his chest suddenly become lighter, as if something that had been pressing there had been removed. Then a warm sensation spread near the surface of his skin, the sting of being thoroughly cleansed, a response from the tissue where the infection had been treated. He could no longer clearly hear footsteps, but could sense the air around him shifting in layers, a sign that the operation was entering its final stage. He did not know how long the surgery lasted. He only knew that the last time he was swallowed by the darkness, there was no longer any sharp pain, nor the pulling sensations, only a profound fatigue, like being drawn into a sleep that had been decided long ago. When he finally woke in a world that felt more solid, the air no longer carried the chill of metal. Instead, it held the mixed scents of warm water, steam, and the faint traces of a fire that had burned low. The light in the wooden hut was softer than that of the operating lamp, and for the first time he realized he was lying in a bed, his head gently propped up. The pain in his chest and abdomen still existed, but it had become a steady ache, no longer tearing outward in waves. His breathing, though weak, had grown more regular. The temperature beneath his skin was no longer dropping rapidly, but seemed to be recovering a rhythm. He slowly moved one finger, almost imperceptibly, yet that tiny motion was enough to confirm to him that he was indeed still alive. He could not lift his head and could not see his surroundings, but he could hear faint footsteps moving without haste, the sound of nurses changing shifts in the corridor. There was also the soft clink of a kettle being placed on a wooden table, the stir of embers in the stove, and, farther away, the scrape of soldiers' boots as they patrolled. These small sounds pieced together into a quiet night, and that quiet meant he had already passed through the most dangerous phase. He did not know how the operation had been completed, nor who the shadows moving under the light had been, but he understood clearly that he had been pulled back from the edge of death. When he tried to recall fragments from the surgery, he could only remember the pressure of the light on his skin, a few brief moments of fragile consciousness, the dull ache in his chest, and the hand that had rested for a moment on his arm, letting him know that he was being attended to. For the first time, he became aware that the enemy could have chosen not to save him. Yet they had not done so. This realization stirred in his weakness a complex emotion, not gratitude, not confusion, but a deeper sense of strangeness. The war had brought him here, and yet a British doctor who knew nothing about him had drawn him back from death. He tried to take a deep breath and felt a slight pulling, a sign that the wound had been newly dressed. He no longer felt the pervasive cold. Instead, he was covered by blankets, with the fading warmth of the stove lingering faintly, yet tangibly around him. He realized that he was about to enter a long period of recovery, and that this recovery would take place in the barracks of the enemy. At this thought, he felt a kind of unsettled calm, because for the first time he understood that although the war had pushed him into darkness, it had also, on this unfamiliar night, given him a narrow yet distinct path back to life. In the weeks that followed, Keller's days were replaced by a peculiar rhythm. The number of times he woke gradually increased, and with each awakening his consciousness returned in short, fragile bursts. The ceiling of the medical hut, mottled from years of damp, appeared in his field of vision like a quiet landmark, helping him find his bearings in the blur of early mornings and the dimness of night. His body remained weak. The bandages at his chest and abdomen were changed at regular intervals, and the wound slowly contracted. Each change of dressing brought with it a warm sting, assuring him that the infection was being cleared. He could not see the wound itself, but from the shifting quality of the pain he could tell that his body was slowly repairing itself from the edges inward. The world outside the hut was still enclosed by war, yet here time seemed deliberately slowed. He could hear the commands called out as patrols changed shifts, and the distant sound of vehicles being moved across muddy ground. These sounds reminded him that the war had not ended, and that he was only temporarily removed from the front lines under the care of the enemy. Sometimes he would wake in the middle of the night and hear the wind slipping through the gaps in the wooden boards, bringing damp air into the room, leaving him with a hazy feeling as the fading warmth of the stove held around his body. He could not be certain that he was truly far from death. He only knew that the operation had drawn a dividing line across his life, separating everything into a before and an after. As his body recovered to the point where he could sit up on his own, he saw for the first time the marks the operation had left on his skin. The pressure under the bandage told him that the treated tissue was moving toward a new state. When the nurse changed the dressing, her movements were gentle and without conversation, yet there was a presence in them that made him feel he had not been overlooked. He began to realize that many people had been sustaining his life during the days when he drifted in and out of sleep, and that none of them were his enemies, even though their uniforms were no different from those of the British soldiers he had once faced in battle. One day he was allowed to sit briefly by the window of the hut. Sunlight fell on him through the glass, bringing with it a warmth he had not felt for a long time. Though it was only the weak light of an English winter, to him it felt like a stable signal, confirming that his body was slowly returning to life. In that moment, he became truly aware that he had survived, not as a temporary extension, but in a way that allowed him to feel that a future might still exist. This realization stirred within his frailty a quiet emotion, not joy, but a gradual readjustment to being part of the world again. A few weeks later, he was informed that he was to be transferred to another prisoner of war camp. Before leaving the medical hut, he looked one last time at the familiar ceiling, familiar wooden walls, the familiar light. He did not know who had saved him, nor did he understand the details of the operation. He had no opportunity to ask, and no strength to grasp any of it fully. He only knew that he left that place with a body that had been stitched back together, and that it became in his memory the quietest and most distant corner of his experience. He was sent to a camp near a northern port and later, after multiple transfers, was moved gradually away from the coast until the war neared its end. When repatriation began in 1946, he returned to Germany along with large numbers of other prisoners of war. The journey was long and chaotic, and the railways ran through cities half destroyed and industrial zones torn apart by bombing. When he set foot again on his homeland for the first time, he was greeted not by victory or the joy of return, but by the emptiness that war had left behind. He walked through streets that resembled ruins, seeing broken beams and walls scoured by rain, and those familiar yet alien sights made him realize that war had not only taken him from his home, but had also turned home into a memory with nowhere to rest. His mother lived in a surviving brick house whose roof, though repaired, still made uncertain noises in wind and rain. Keller's body had not fully recovered, but he could move along the walls for support and complete simple physical tasks with slow and careful motions. He regarded these small efforts as proof that he was still alive, and he treated the memory of having been saved by the enemy as a quiet justification for continuing to persevere in this devastated place. The postal system in post-war Germany had grown sluggish, with letters often passing through multiple transfers before reaching their destination. One morning he sat on a wooden chair in the kitchen with sunlight falling across the table through cracked window glass. In that moment he had, for the first time, a strong and lasting thought. He wanted to write a letter. It was not to express gratitude, nor to seek a response, but to give that fragment of his life that had unfolded in the enemy's camp a place to belong. He did not know the doctor's name, nor how to put into words the blurred memories of the operation. All he could recall was the light, the sound of metal instruments, the smell of anesthetic, and the hand that rested briefly on his arm. He realized that perhaps that person would never know what had become of him, and perhaps the letter would never be delivered at all. But that did not matter. Writing it down was in itself a way of widening the distance between himself and death, of allowing his life to extend a little further. He wrote of those days on paper with an extremely slow and almost halting hand. It was not a plea nor a confession, but a simple statement of fact, that in the darkest moment of the war, a British doctor had saved him, allowing him to care for his mother amid the ruins, and to know, when he looked back on that operation years later, that he had once been gently and resolutely brought back into the world. When he finished, he looked at the sheet of paper for a long time. The paper was coarse because post-war supplies were scarce, but in his eyes it was calm and steady. He sealed the letter and handed it over at the post office without any expectation in his heart. As he left, he let out a quiet breath, as though he had finally returned that long-sleeping memory to where it belonged. The letter drifted for a long time along the routes of the post-war mail system. It was sent from a German city surrounded by ruins, crossed borders, travelled along railways that were still under repair, and then entered the British postal system, where supplies were still being tightly controlled. The postmarks were faint, the paper slightly curled by damp, the address written simply, yet surprisingly clearly. Months later, this letter, which had endured such a long journey, arrived at a hospital in southern England. It was a brick building that had been in use since before the war, with patched exterior walls and window frames worn by years of moisture. In the hospital's front hall, stacks of record sheets, boxes of medicines, and a large number of wartime files withdrawn from field hospitals had long been piled together. The postman placed this inconspicuous letter among a bundle of ordinary mail, and no one realized that it belonged to a man rebuilding his life far away amid the ruins. When the duty staff placed the letter into the doctor's mail slot, dawn was just breaking. The corridors of the hospital felt especially quiet as the night shift ended, with only faint clinks coming from the instrument room. It was only after finishing his routine review of reports that Dr. Carter noticed the letter. The envelope was old with slightly cracked edges, and the stamp was a rough temporary issue from the post-war period. As he slowly opened it under the lamp, he did not expect to find anything in particular. When he unfolded the paper, he saw handwriting that was unsteady, yet carefully kept upright. The words neither complained nor embellished. They simply seemed to confirm something that had always existed, but had never been spoken aloud. The letter was not long, yet it presented the entire experience in an almost plain manner. It did not describe the details of the surgery, nor did it attempt to convey dramatic emotion. It simply stated, at the most crucial point, that the operation had allowed the writer to live, to care for his mother amid the ruins, and to carry, through long nights, a steady sense of certainty whenever he recalled the light of the British medical hut. The letter did not ask for a reply, nor did it include a complete return address. It merely mentioned that if this letter could reach its destination, then the sender had already received the answer he sought. After reading, Carter folded the paper carefully, his movements quiet. He did not stop his work for the letter, yet as he placed it into a drawer, he realized that he remembered the face of that wounded man, even though at the time the man had barely been conscious. He remembered the infected wound, the tray of worn instruments in the wooden hut, and the pale reflection on the skin under the surgical lamp that had shone for so long. He did not see himself as the savior named in the letter. It had simply been the duty he was required to carry out at that time, part of the system, a task he could not abandon as a doctor. Yet when this letter crossed the sea, passed through ruins, and travelled along the rebuilding postal network to finally arrive here, it made him aware for the first time in many years that many acts of healing did not acquire their meaning in the moment, but only settled quietly into the course of a life long afterward. He did not write back because the letter carried no complete address, and there was not enough information to ensure a safe delivery. He simply placed it inside an old folder that contained a few records he had kept from the war, documents he was unwilling to discard but had never mentioned to anyone. He put this letter at the top, letting it become a continuation of that period of his life. Years later, Keller still did not know whether the letter had arrived, whether the mail route had been interrupted, or whether he had made a mistake in the address. He only sometimes thought of that night lit by the lamp when dusk settled, recalling the brief moments of clarity on the operating table and the instant when his arm had been held in place. He understood that whether or not the letter had reached its destination, he had already handed that memory over. He had untied it from his own life and allowed it to become something that existed outside the war. In the end, what war leaves behind is not victors and vanquished, but countless stories of ordinary people. These stories are scattered by the wind and buried beneath ruins, yet in a few lines of handwriting that are picked up again, they find a way to endure. In a single operation, an enemy and a prisoner completed a brief yet genuine crossing of lives, and the letter sent years later allowed that encounter to transcend the war itself. As Keller went on living in a city under reconstruction, and Carter continued his duties in quiet hospital corridors, they were no longer enemies, but two people once bound to the same strand of history. It was within this calm, unspoken connection that the shadow of war began slowly to recede, and life itself in silence was allowed to continue.